Would you believe me if I told you that a second civil war was fought right here in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains? Because behind me is a POW camp that was used in the aftermath of this war at the Bryceville Community Church. And in order to understand this second civil war, which is called the Coal Creek War, you need to understand the lead up to the 1891 and 92 conflicts. Basically, they were taking prisoners and leasing them out, the state of Tennessee was, to private companies. And this precipitated a conflict with the miners because naturally their labor was being taken up. The miners were being fired when the mine owners figured, we'll just use slaves. And this was in 1891. Well, at that time, Governor Buchanan was elected, and he was a member of the Tennessee Farms and Labor Alliance, and it was basically an early union which claimed to represent the interests of the common worker. When Governor Buchanan was elected, it became a moment of excitement for a lot of the mine workers and farmers because he was a member of this Tennessee Farmers Alliance, very labor friendly. So the activists in the state felt emboldened to start making demands. They asked, one, we don't want you to be using your own weighers. If we mine a ton of coal, then you have to have us weigh it, or a union representative weigh it. And on top of that, they demanded to stop being paid in scrib, which was a funny money. Now, the way scrib worked was it was basically fake currency that you could use to redeem your work at a company store. It was only usable at company properties, but these companies, they owned the entire town. So all of the area around here, which was all new towns, you would have a house leased out by the company, you would be eating company food, you would be riding on the train using company dollars, and they would all demand that money back. Now, you could pay with scrib, but as soon as you were fired, that scrib becomes worthless, and you're now in debt to the company, which would result in you going to prison and then coming right back as a slave under the convict lease program. The demands of the farmers were issued primarily to the owners of the companies themselves, and most of them agreed to it because they saw the election of Buchanan as foreboding for their profit margin. So the Tennessee Coal Mining Company decided to fire all of their miners and just bring in convict lease labor, slave labor. And it was very cheap for them, but it also took all of these people and made them very mad. And of course, the town was owned by the company. All of the buildings were company property. So what they did was they bulldozed the buildings, or they tore down the buildings that the miners used to live in and they would rent from the company, and they built a stockade for the prisoners. And this was the last straw. Miners, hundreds of them, marched from out of town down through the valley armed with shotguns, pistols, rifles from the Civil War. And they tore down the stockades, they burned the stockades, and peacefully, and I was surprised at the number of times they did exactly this, all peacefully, took the prisoners, marched them to the nearby train station, and said, we'll see you later. They sent them back to Knoxville, and then they took over a local telegraph office and sent a telegram to Governor Buchanan and said, you're a supporter of labor, please send backup. But what Buchanan did alienated him from his base. He sent in the National Guard to Knoxville to make sure the prison transfer happened peacefully, and then he accompanied a train from Knoxville up to Coal Creek, and at the train station, he was confronted by a number of miners, and he gave a hemming and hawing speech addressing the local community, saying, we need to wait. We need to let politicians handle this. I'm going to start a special legislative session, and we're going to be able to enforce the law. The miners thought that he was there to help them, but when they saw the militia setting up perimeters around the local prisoners and bringing them back in and having them work, when they saw this, they figured that the governor had double-crossed them and he was no longer their friend. And so people began firing shots at the compound. It wasn't a full assault yet. That would happen later. But one shot struck the governor's house that he was staying at within the stockade, and he immediately left back for Knoxville and then Nashville. He was out of the picture for the time being. And the National Guard, or rather the Tennessee State Militia, was sent in to provide backup and protect the prisoners while they worked. And he retreated back and kept assuring local union activists that he would do everything within his power to legally enforce the laws already on the book. For a time, things went peacefully because local union activists, or rather just labor activists, were trying to bide their people. They were saying, wait for Governor Buchanan to do something. But by July 20th of 1890, it became clear that he wasn't really going to do anything with it. So 2,000 men armed with guns, shotguns, rifles, they all walked up to the stockade and they talked to Colonel Seaver, who was incidentally a great-grandson of the founder of the state of Tennessee, and they said, we're taking this place over. We're taking this Fort Anderson. And Seaver demanded that they not burn anything down, and again, the miners peacefully agreed to this, and then he said, all right, we're surrendering so long as you bring no harm to us. And they kept to this wish, and they sent all of the prisoners back up to Knoxville. Well, this time, the governor arrived in force again with the militia, and he said, all right, we've negotiated a truce, 60 days. You give us 60 days and I'll have these laws passed through with a special legislative session. And so again, hopes were high that something was going to happen, but nothing did. In fact, it only got worse because at that legislative session, it authorized, of course, nothing about enforcing the laws already on the books that would protect the miners. The governor said that the governor, during the laws, it was found, the governor could use anything in his power to stop an uprising, that any interference with the convict lease system constituted a felony, and he basically issued a warning to all the miners, don't try anything funny. And this was just one last straw over one last straw over one last straw, and people got mad. And so on October 28th, the leaders of the community who were negotiating with Governor Buchanan and the mine owners decided to resign from their posts, and they very discreetly urged the miners to take up arms. And so on October 31st, they again stormed Fort Anderson, burned down the stockades, burned down neighboring stockades in the surrounding communities, gave the prisoners regular clothing, so they were no longer in their prison costumes, their prison uniforms, and they gave them hot meals and said, don't commit any more crimes. And this is what caught the real attention of the government. They now viewed this as an actual uprising, and this didn't bode well for the community. After the capture of Colonel Anderson by miners, the governor decided to send in 583 militiamen and tried to establish a number of posses in the surrounding counties. The idea of establishing posses was that sheriffs were able to deputize, and still are, their own citizens who were not trained police in order to put down an insurrection. Now, certainly in this county, Anderson County, they decided not to do that at all. They just ignored the order, and surrounding counties did the same. The governor was now hated by both the locals, the miners, and the mine owners. And they brought out these 583 militiamen, which were on governor's orders, and they came out here to help find Colonel Anderson. They found him, they released him, and in the process, a number of volunteers arrived up from Knoxville. These were untrained men, basically a posse. They were just people who volunteered. They were encountered in a local valley by members of the miner activist groups and ambushed. And it was supposed to be a peaceful ambush. They were going to put them on a train like they had done so many times before and send them back. But because they were a posse and they were not trained, they began shooting and 2 of them died. And following the 583 militiamen taking over the town, the miners and their families and all of the activists were put in prison in the church behind me. Now, considering that quite a few people died, considering that this was an actual uprising, it is surprising to see that the only man who was given a decent stint in prison went by the name of D.B. Monroe, and he was only given 7 years. And the governor realized that the whole system of convict leasing was an outdated system and totally impractical, and it cost too much to enforce it. So what he did was he bought property, the state of Tennessee rather, bought property in Monroe County and allowed the leasing contracts to expire. And these convicts were just sent to build a new prison down in Monroe County, which was totally inescapable, and work until only a few years ago, because this convict system of labor is still going to this day. With the labor uprising suppressed in 1891, state authorities were forced to try to brainstorm ideas on how they could continue using this prison slave labor to their advantage. And surrounding me is the result of their brainchild, using the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, which was open and continued running as a coal mine until only a couple years before I started filming this video. Basically, the idea was in 1896, they brought out a bunch of geologists into these mountains, and they said, what is both the perfect area to start coal mines that is also inaccessible, remote, and almost inescapable? And they arrived at this site. Now, in 1896, a lot of these convicts were forced to come and live in a tent colony, and they created a sort of wooden stockade. But by the early 1900s, 1920s, it had turned into a labyrinthian castle-type structure where they kept a lot of prison labor, and many of these men died. Now, I'm judging this from what I know from history. They say they don't know who is buried in this cemetery or how many of them, but they have placed these stones here in recent years, they weren't originally here, as an estimate of where they're buried. And they say maybe 500. Now, the coal mine operators said maybe a few hundred people died when they dug a tunnel in West Virginia, and they said that they were dying of silicosis because they were working at gunpoint. However, a congressional investigation found up to 1,000, if not more, were likely buried in their local cemetery. So you look around here and you see an entire field of graves, and it makes you wonder how many are buried here. There's no record of them, and there's no record of what they did, so it's very likely that these company guards were just driving through town, and many of them were black, and they wouldn't be missed, and nobody would investigate it. Just take them and throw them in the back of the van, and ship them off to the coal mines, where they would presumably work to death.
Had another song made up one time there was an explosion in the coal mine. Payday, payday, oh payday. Payday at Coal Creek no more. Payday at Coal Creek no more. Miss me, oh, miss me. Miss me, baby, when I'm gone. Miss me, baby, when I'm gone. Payday, payday, oh, payday. Payday at Coal Creek no more.
The next stop on our Coal Wars History of Appalachia video is at the grave of Barney F. Graham, and understand that he was killed in 1933 by a private policeman by the name of Jack Green, hired out by Fentress Coal and Coke. So Graham was sent here to advocate for an end to the workers' dispute. There was a labor dispute, a wage dispute in town going on for about a year, and he wanted to negotiate, but the coal companies decided to hire out these armed guards. The armed guards' authority was only on the coal mines, but because they were in the back pocket of law enforcement, they would wander through town flashing their guns. They had 2 pistols each and even a couple gas guns that they would sling around every now and then. And they would openly brag that we were sent here to get Barney Graham. And a man by the name of Jack Green did this. He shot Graham in cold blood. And so many of these labor union activists remain unrecognized. I found so little information on Barney Graham. But this is a period which is a fascinating history, and I think the history needs to be told because Graham's killing is overshadowed by the beginning of World War II.